So I thought I'd talk to you about the Marine Decarbonisation Strategy, which has been produced by UK government. The document itself was published in April this year, and it's very much a UK strategy. But it's quite interesting because it's both national and international. When you read it, it's very much talking about Britain's place in the maritime world. So it's quite an outward-facing document as well. There's a lot of talk about the International Maritime Organisation and international treaties and things. And it's unusual for UK government. It's not one of those where Britain's got to be first all the time stuff, which is really wearing. So that's quite interesting to see how it's going. And it also does mention it points out there are some matters which are devolved, such as ports and ferries. And some items sort of obviously cross over between the two, so some military applications of ports and various things. But what I want to do is just have a quick rattle through it, because I think there's some big opportunities for Orkney in it, and I thought it was useful just to explain how we can play a part in it. So a few bits of numbers and stats that are in there at the start. 95% of all of our imports and exports for the country flow through go by ships, and it's about 8% of our transport emissions in total. And surprisingly, shipping is greater than bus, rail, and domestic aviation combined. That's just domestic shipping. And so the shipping itself is significant to us, but it's also significant internationally, and the emissions from shipping across the world are basically about or greater than quite a lot of countries' emissions overall. So it's like there's another country out there. That's all the ships that are rattling around all over the place. And it looks at the number of pieces about how the energy efficiency and the way ships operate all comes together. And so it talks very much about this whole issue of well-to-wake emissions. And they break that down really, going back in old style, about oil wells through the extraction, the fuel production, the storage, the bunkering, i.e. the storage of the fuel on shore, and then on to the storage aboard, the way that fuel is then converted into the energy is released in it, and then the energy to actually make the ship go through the water. So they talk about well-to-wake emissions. And looking at some of those for the UK, particularly in 2019, this is a bar graph, a pie chart showing UK maritime emissions. And the domestic-only bits, i.e. the vessels that don't leave UK waters, is that 29% slice. The bit of ships that basically don't come to the UK, but they're British vessels that are rattling around the rest of the world, is about 23%, and the balance is ships which come and go to the UK. The point being that roughly half of those emissions are the ships that are coming and going. And it also helpfully breaks this down by vessel type, and this is in million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2019. And the commercial is the blue, and the leisure is the green. And it shows that Gareth, chill. I'm doing this bit first. We'll do the AGM, and then we'll do yours afterwards. So get your breath back. So, the ferries and offshore together are over a third of the total emissions, but it's quite helpful. It shows a bunch of the different things that are there, such as tugs, 0.2, cruise ships, general cargo, liquefied gas, other service vessels, fishing boats, oil tankers at the top, and chemical tankers as well. So that's quite a helpful distribution of the emissions for UK domestic shipping. But in terms of Orkney, we don't know. We don't have that level of detail. We do have quite a good detail that was done back from the 2019 energy audit that Aquaterra did. I thought it was an alarm about to kick off, that's all we need, which you'll be familiar with, which really shows the green box, which is the amount of energy that is delivered through electricity. And basically, overall, we can see the distribution of the different types of use of energy, and shipping makes up about 19% of our emissions from those estimates. And if you look at what's happening with terrestrial transport, road transport, that's about 18% of our emissions in total. You can compare and contrast that with the work that's been done by the National Grid, where they did their future energy scenarios the other year, back in 23 for 2024. And this is the work that's been taken over by NISO. They had the presentation a few weeks ago. If you look there at the emissions for aviation and shipping and road transport, you find, in fact, that in the UK as a whole, land is roughly twice maritime. So ours is equals the UK as a whole is about double. So that shows how atypical we are, and it shows us where some of the opportunity is that we've got in Orkney. And if you look as well at the future energy scenarios, they look at how to get to decarbonisation in 2050, I think it is, 2040, I can't remember. And that looks at a series of scenarios, and there are three in particular. One in the bottom right-hand side is about using a lot of hydrogen, bottom left is about electricity, and the top right is about a general transition in quite a mixed economy. And in the top left-hand corner, the grey, or the khaki, fawn, whatever it is, colour block there shows that the amount of electricity about 229 terawatt hours, and in all the others, it's in the 700 to 800 terawatt hours. But in all three of those, they've all got the same figure for shipping and aviation. In other words, they haven't really considered the electrification of shipping. They haven't really considered the fuel that we needed if we go down a hydrogen route through the fuel efficiencies. So I think there are some faults in some of the energy scenario stuff that was done a little while ago. And frankly, we have this view of where this is all going to go from our side of things, and that is that energy, all of our fuels are basically going to be electricity at some point, and they will then be turned into other things. The question is what those other things are going to be and how they're going to be used. So going back to the Marine Decarbonisation Strategy, it looks at a series of different policy areas, and there are 5 big clumps of these policies, and I'll just rattle through those quite quickly. First one's about fuel use, and it talks about the different ways in which fuels can be used in shipping, and it considers the various fuels that are there: hydrogen, methanol, ammonia, battery electric, nuclear, and also biofuels, but it doesn't consider the Fischer-Tropsch process. In other words, it doesn't consider making synthetic hydrocarbons from hydrogen. That's not in there. That flow diagram doesn't have that in for some reason. I'm not quite sure why. In addition to that, if you look at the balanced, the way they're looking at fuel use, they've looked at different scenarios in the way the mixes of fuel there could be. And each of these bars basically is the same thing, which is 2030 on the left hand of the bar, 2040 in the middle, and 2050 on the right. And then there are different ways in which those fuel mixes work. And it's balanced: more ammonia, no ammonia, more electric, more biofuel. And there are different fuel mixes that they've looked at. But once again, there are no hydrogen derivatives in any of that lot. So they've not looked at liquid hydrocarbons made from hydrogen at all. They do talk about it in the text, but they didn't look at it in some of the scenarios for some reason. I'm not quite sure why. And also interestingly, they looked at, with those scenarios, they then looked at what happens with pollutants and the different pollutants of sulfur oxides, nitrous oxides, and particles, PM 2.5s. The middle one is around about an ammonia-based fuel system, if that's the way it goes, and that shows an increase in nitrous oxide emissions compared with what we've got at the moment. All the others are generally a little bit lower, but nonetheless, depending which route you take, there are some significant pollutants in all this lot. It also goes on to look at things like the price of emissions, and it says it's going to introduce greenhouse gas emission pricing from 2026. And that's pretty soon. And it also says the UK government is going to push the International Maritime Organisation for global pricing in 2027. So there's going to be quite a push to actually start to charge for the emissions for greenhouse gases from shipping. And only about 2 years ago, the International Maritime Organisation were really against that. So that's been quite a change that's moved. Now, these emission prices apply to vessels over 5,000 tonnes. So what does a 5,000 ton vessel look like? Well, Rossi and Yartland are 11,000, Hamnavo's nearly 9,000, Alfred is about 3, the Pentalina is 2,500 tons, and Varagon and the others are in the 928 ton mark. So the point is, this is going to capture the shipping that's coming up from Aberdeen, but it's not going to capture the shipping that goes across the Pentland Firth at the moment, well, certainly the Alfred and Pentalina. And it won't capture Orkney ferries. They get caught in something else later on. It also talks quite a lot about zero emissions at berth. In other words, when vessels park, making sure they're not emitting pollution. And there's a call for evidence that's open now about that. It goes on the 26th. And I think Orkney's got some bits that we can chip into that. And this once again interlinks really with the planning that NESO, the National Energy System Operator, was talking about the other week, which is about making sure that if vessels are going to be berthed, they are going to be taking a lot of energy whilst they're alongside. And we'll talk about that in a second. Because some of these connections are going to be private wire, some of them will be direct. And if you look at what's going on in Orkney, we have actually got 2 vessels which definitely use private wire networks, possibly 3, I suppose. Pentland Ferries have got a private wire, and the Hamnavo, when she plugs in, now draws up to, I think, 250 kilowatts. And so there's already some electrification starting in this space, and there's the sort of the small-scale domestic stuff in marinas, and there's the slightly more industrial scales power supplies for fishing boats which are on the pier. So the electrification of vessels is starting, and Aquaterra has done some other studies about power buoys for power to liners when they come alongside, because what's the future going to look like? What are we going to have to supply by way of power for vessels coming alongside? And just for a little example, that vessel is the MSC Pretzoia. Anyway, that's got 2 21.85 megawatt electric propulsion engines in it. So she's got 40 megawatts of propulsion power that's electric. Now that is then provided by a series of diesel engines, and it gets through 250 tons of fuel a day. So that is something in the region of continuously running about 118 megawatts. That's what she's running at. So if we've got to put that sort of power alongside, we're going to need to supply something like 66 megawatts to charge it for 8 hours for it to go and do its thing. So this is probably coming. How the hell are we going to do that? I have no idea. But anyway, watch this space. But there is obviously a big energy sink that's coming. It also talks about, further on the zero emissions at berth, it looks at the wake-to-well emissions at berth and breaks this down, and that is oil tankers and ferries are the 2 big ones, and then chemical tankers, liquefied stuff, and you get, oops, a daisy. And you get down to bulk carriers, ferry, passengers only, and then miscellaneous other. And in it, the report says something which I'm surprised about, and I don't think it's right, frankly. It says that in 2019, 46% of domestic maritime fuel emissions were from vessels that were on their berth. That can't be right. Because basically, I would argue that, let's say, vessels go around during the day and generally are parked at night. So roughly, they're saying during the time they're at night, they're running their engines as hard as they do during the day. No, that can't be right. So anyway, I've got a query into Department of Transport about that, because I suspect somebody's put a decimal place in the wrong area. Because if you look at Hamnavo, when she's on berth, she'll draw 250 kilowatts. On passage, 6.5 megawatts. Well, you'll know if I'm right on those numbers, but it's that sort of order. You know, it's just wrong. So anyway, the point is there could be a miscalculation in this about the scale of energy that's needed for shoreside power. So it'd be really useful if we get to the bottom of that. I think we can make a useful contribution about it. So that's the vessels on berth. It then goes on. Oh yeah, the other point they're notice that oil tankers are 25% of the emissions that they're claiming when the vessels are tied up, which I'm assuming is the handling of oil and heating it and getting it ashore and stuff. So if we stop sending oil around, that's a 25% saving in the bag before we start. I mentioned that the council will get caught with smaller vessels, and this is the chart showing the greenhouse gas emissions from different types of vessels. So the blue bit is over 5,000 tonnes, 400 to 5,000 tonnes is the blue bit, and then below 400 gross tonnes is the green slab. And basically, once again, there's a call for evidence now, and they say they will develop measures to capture smaller vessels, and the dark blue bit would be where Orkney ferries would fit, and clearly they're doing some things now about trying to look at different ways of reducing emissions, particularly through things like the ZEVI programme with the Artemis vessel, which is the one on the left is here. The Charger is now here and operating, and very bright, I thought, when I drove past Kirkwall Harbour. Everybody else saw it, like a beacon standing up in the middle of the harbour. And then the one on the right is due to be coming later in the year. And the other point is there's a lot of other stuff going to be coming, which will be things like offshore wind. So the offshore wind vessels which are going to be operating out east and west of Orkney are inevitably going to be highly electrified. It seems implausible that they are going to try and put green energy out there and get to them in sooty diesel-powered vessels. So there is going to be a change that's going to go on. So there's going to be a need to supply that as well with power. So we've got to work out how that's all going to work. And then sort of the final real piece on this is all about vessel efficiency in their policy areas. And they basically say there are numerous areas where vessels need to improve, and this is the extract from the chart. But the bottom line really is the number one issue up there is actually hull design. And hull design is going to be critically important to making sure we can decarbonise, because if you have an energy efficient hull, you've reduced the size of the decarbonisation problem for starters. And so they say there is positive change coming, and they say the UK will push harder. So this is the UK saying it will lobby the International Maritime Organisation to make changes faster than they naturally want to, which is interesting. But this issue about hull design is fundamental, and we've got a really good local example about that with the Hamnavo and the Alfred, which are effectively on sort of very similar trips. And in terms of efficiency, the Alfred and the Hamnavo both have got similar sorts of carrying characteristics. So the Alfred will take 100 cars and Hamnavo 95, similar sorts of speeds, but the principal differences really are in the amount of energy that's or the power units in both. So Alfred is 3 megawatts, Hamnavo is just under 9, and also the build costs of each are dramatically different, under 20 million and nearly 60 million in the same year prices. And so the point is that we are in a position where I think we've got to be really careful that when we do hull replacements, we are looking at efficient hulls, because that is a critical part of us helping to get decarbonisation operating. Because if we look at our ferries here, a few years ago, the International Maritime Organisation said that they need to get to halfway to net zero by 2050. Well, they've changed that now, and they're saying they have to get to zero by 2050. And at the moment, the Orkney ferries as a whole use around 3 million litres of diesel a year. And at the moment, if we go and replace these hulls with identical hulls, we'll end up with pretty much like-for-like emissions. So we're not going to put a dent in the 2050 side of things unless we do something radical to the power supplies, which is going to be a bit of a game. But as I said, if we use a more efficient hull shape, we could cut our emissions by 50% pretty much overnight. The hull shape is fundamental to helping us to get through decarbonisation. And the point is, you can do it with hull shapes, but you could do a radically different approach with things like the ZEVI side of things. Those use about 10% of the energy to move around. So we could end up with zero emissions in part by different hull shapes, and that's, I think, something that Orkney has got a really good chance to offer what the best solution really is, because it's probably going to be a mix of hydrofoils and catamarans, and it's almost inevitably going to be largely electric, but with some green diesel for hybrids and emergencies. So, where does that leave us? Orkney's role. So, it strikes me there are 3 areas of particular change, although for some reason I've got 4 on my list, so there you go, that shows me. So the existing vessels, as we talked about, really, we are going to have to replace our internal ferries. We have a choice about what we replace them with, and I think we really need to be very focused on making sure we make the right decisions there. The whole issue is about what future activity is going to be coming. So that's notionally a hydrogen-powered vessel, which I think is probably implausible, but this whole scale of what's going to go on, the number of vessels that are going to be operating in Orkney waters to support offshore wind is going to be a considerable energy sink that we need to make sure we understand. But that really does give us R&D opportunities. This is the world's first fully autonomous freighter, which operates, I think, in Norway. Uncrewed, which was, you can see the size of it, delivering freight. That is coming. There will be some of this stuff that's going to happen, and once you take the people out, then it make some differences to how the fuel is handled as well. But the question for Orkney is, which bets do we really need to place? Where are we going to play our part? What should be the way in which we make this work? Well, I'm going to argue there are a couple of bets. We need to make the problem as small as possible. Efficient hulls is absolutely critical, making that work. And also efficient routes and logistics and ticketing, believe it or not, has an effect. Why you have to take your car to Edy when you want to drive around on Edy and don't just walk on your own and use a car that's already on Edy is a mystery. My car does not particularly want to go to Edy. I don't need to take it, but the point is I have to, because there's no through ticketing process, and it's chaotic. So the point is there is an opportunity to improve logistics by improving some back office stuff like ticketing. There's some evidence we're making some progress in this space, but I am worried there's some dubious direction at the moment. So at the moment, as I understand it, the council has decided to go for monohull replacements of Orkney ferries, and has not really considered multi-hulls very thoroughly, in my opinion. In terms of the routing, there's some modernisation that's gone on. There's now the ticketing system on Orkney ferries is better, but what are the next steps? And I'm not quite sure. But there's an opportunity to do a lot more. Secondly, we need to electrify everything we can now. So that's whatever vessels we can, so some definitely new vessels, and make some intrusions into some of the existing vessels there, like we've done with Hamnavo, putting it on shoreside power. There will be a lot of other stuff we can do in that sort of area. And we've made tentative steps in that space, which is good. Also anticipating we are going to have all electric vessels coming. And we really need to make sure that the power supplies are big enough, and we've worked out the way in which we're going to store the energy ashore to allow whatever electrification happens, because it's inevitably going to end up with some buffering, and where's that going to be? Have we allowed the space for it? And what are the cable routes going to be for getting the power to the ports? We need to make sure we're thinking about this stuff now, because we know where the ports are. What we've got to do is make sure we've got the right means to actually distribute that. And at the moment I'm seeing we have got some increased capacity. I think there's 12 megawatts has been applied for Hatston and 8 for Deepwater Quay, something like that. I'm not quite sure the numbers at the moment. But is that enough? Doesn't sound like it to me. And have we future-proofed the substations to make sure there'll be enough space to actually electrify things if that's the way this goes? And then finally, really making sure we absolutely engage with R&D and the Maritime Coast Guard Agency, because there's a big opportunity here for the UK to really make it work. But the point is, I think we've done some work pretty successfully with things like the CMDC, which is the Clean Maritime Demonstration Competition. I think it's on round 6, 7 now, and I think there's been a series of rounds which Orkney has managed to win projects in, and there's more announcements on that coming. But we need to do a lot more with the R&D. But the point is we really need a plan. We need to co-create a vision, because this is not just the council ought to do this. This is Orkney needs to do this and make this work. It's going to be much bigger than any one player, that's for certain. And it needs to be informed by local expertise. And that's Pete Oswald, late Pete Oswald, many of you remember, who was an expert in synthetic fuels. We have knowledge in the community which we need to make sure we use. And the plan really needs to be clearly visible to all, so that we can all work out how we can contribute to it. And the point is, we really, do have an opportunity, but we need to take it now. So the document is out. It's not a bad read, and if you like ships, there's a lot of pictures of different ships in it, which is really nice. So I'm happy to take questions about this at the later if we want. But I thought it was just useful to give you a bit of insight into what's going on. In fact, if anybody got any questions about it now, get those. Martin.
Neil, it seems to me that the choice between efficient hulls and replacing what we've got is like a two-horse race between a live horse and a dead horse. Why are OIC pursuing the dead horse route?
That's an interesting question, and personally I think they've been misadvised. There was a lot of work that was done over a series of years through things. There was an outline business case, a strategic business case, then an outline business case that looked at the replacement of the ferries, and I think that started back in 2010, 2013, probably, something like that. And there have been a series of reports, and both of those significant reports both said, well, we won't decide what the shape of the hulls is going to be, we'll leave that till later, but let's proceed on the basis we think they're going to be monohulls. So I think there's been a sort of certain institutional bias towards monohulls all the way through. And then in June last year, there was an announcement made that there'd been a meeting in development and infrastructure. They considered a report, and that report had then, from a company called Leadship, and that report had recommended monohulls. But having looked at that report, I think there are a number of errors in it, and it's not clear exactly how that report was pulled together. So I think there's a need to make sure we challenge on this, because the danger is we go and build the wrong vessels. And the point is, if the vessels we procure are twice the cost of the vessels that we actually need, that's a chunk of money that's wasted. And if the vessels themselves are less fuel efficient than the vessels that we could have chosen, we're wasting fuel. By my estimate, there's £70 million potentially being wasted by picking the wrong vessels.
Thank you for speaking.
Oh, Simon, go, and then we'll take Gareth.
Hi, folks. I don't have a question, but risk of cliche, a few comments, if I may, as someone else is interested in this. The cruise ship stats, just be a little bit careful of tons per day. That normally is quoted as what the ship would need at full power. Cruise lines don't generally run around at full power because it's expensive, but we're still talking tens of megawatts at the key side, so that's the important thing. The 46% of power emissions being at berth intrigued me as well. I went to a number of their webinars when they're talking about their modelling. I'm skeptical, but I sort of believe it. That's only for domestic shipping, UK to UK. So there's no long distance deep sea stuff in there. Globally, they think the figure is 14%. So an at berth includes any time a ship is doing less than 1 knot near the port. So it also includes at anchor, it includes manoeuvring, it may include some DP operations if they're close to a port. But I'm thinking, given that it's UK to UK only, think of all the ships sitting in Aberdeen going nowhere for weeks at a time, running generators. Think about all the Dover to Calais ferries that keep their engines running all day while going nowhere for some of it. I agree that it's still a lot, given that they're using so much less power when not using propulsion, but I'd be interested to see what you hear back anyway. I'm skeptical, but not totally dismissive of that one. The Orkney ferries monohulls thing, as I haven't read the report, but I did listen quite carefully to the radio and stuff about it. As far as I can tell, this comes from a stipulation that the existing piers had to be used. And investing in changes to the piers, which might give paybacks for more efficient vessels over their lifetime, was out of scope. So I think that's where that comes from. And there might be good reasons there based on cash flow, I guess. The piers would have to happen early, but it does seem like a strange thing to stipulate from the beginning.
Sorry. No, go on.
Oh, sorry.
No, carry on, finish, and I'll
finally, on shore power, I agree. I mean, if it's not 46%, it's still going to be a significant amount. And that needs figuring out. It seems to me there's two things on that. There's figuring out supply, as you described. The other thing that I think unlocks an awful lot is figuring out a set of standardized connectors and protocols. Handover is bespoke, and that's fine because it's a ferry with a single route. It's not going to be a single thing because a cruise ship needs something different to the Pentalina, say, but having a set of standardized connectors and connection protocols that ports across the world can invest in and that ship owners can invest in, knowing they'll be usable wherever they go, seems to me like one of the key things that will unlock that actually happening. I'll stop talking now. Thanks.
Thanks, Simon. All very valid points. If I can just pick up on Martin, do you want to talk about the connectors? Well, you have to give Martin the mic, and we'll just pick up on the connectors. Meantime, I'll just answer the bit about the piers. You're right, Simon. That was a stipulation, and it remains a stipulation that whatever the new vessels are, they have to work with existing link spans. But there's also now a plan to actually then replace the link spans after they've replaced the ferries. And the reason for that is that for cash flow reasons, they want to make sure they're getting the better service of the ferries as quickly as possible, and don't want to complicate it by changing the link spans. However, there's an element within it which says that you can't possibly have a wider vessel on any of the piers, on any of the link spans at the moment than the existing vessels, which to my mind is completely wrong, because basically there's water next to on that side. You don't try and put it on the pier, that's a bad idea. Try and put it in the water next to the pier, which would seem to be plenty of space. And so there's an element in there which I think, once again, they seem to be misadvised or seem to have worked into a bit of a corner with it. Because to go to something like the Pentalina is 20 metres beam, it would be the only point of pinch in the whole thing is probably coming into the eastern side of the harbour, in other words, into the bit where the marina is, which is 38 metres wide, but it's actually a 35 metre clear channel in there. So getting something through that in a strong wind would be a challenge. So you need to make sure you have a vessel with a right degree of manoeuvrability to allow you to manoeuvre into that bit. But I don't think there are any other piers which have got a significant restriction. Stronsey is a little bit of it's in a little bit of a bay, but once again, it's much wider than that anyway. So I think personally, I think there's a need for greater examination of that. Martin.
Yeah, my comment was to do with the connectors. Bergen recently commissioned, the port of Bergen in Norway, recently commissioned a supply for cruise liners, and they're proposing banning any cruise liners going in that haven't been fitted with a suitable connector, but they claim they've got a standardised connector, and it's either 6.6 or 11 kV and 200 amps, and they're providing up to 4 connectors per berth, which is about, at 11 kV, is about 11.5 megawatts.
Interesting.
So that's the size they're providing per berth.
Yeah.
To my knowledge, which is probably incomplete, apart from them, the only people who are currently mandating shore power for cruise ships are some of the ports in Florida that have many ships a day, and they're there often enough that it's worth the investment. I'd be very curious to know whether that's the same standardized connector as the other standardized connector in the other parts of the world.
Well, let's look at American precedent in other things, shall we?
In Bergen they put power electronics in so they could provide those 2 voltages at either 50 or 60 hertz, depending on what the ship already used.
We'll take Gareth. The point, however, remains that you need a decent sized wire down there, you need the cable routes, you need to have thought this lot through. Exactly what you put on the end of it may well change over time, but having a standardised approach makes sense. And once again, quite often the people who set the legislation and drive this then end up with a market share for this for later on. So, Gareth.
Yeah, I was kind of feeling a bit deja vu, how many times have we talked about this over the last 2 decades, probably, occasionally, that we knew this was coming. And so then I was trying to think more positively and say, well, look, we've had a great introduction again tonight, or not an update, let's call it, of where we are. But we've got a disconnect in our community, and how do we find a way of having a conversation which is a whole community conversation? And I wonder whether, when it's the ORF AGM, it's a good thing to think about what we're doing as an organisation. Should we be proactive and try and have more of a a kind of round table discussion type meeting with a number of maritime interests. So I'm thinking Northlink, I'm thinking Orkney Ferries, I'm thinking harbours, and the workboat community, and actually just get people in one room in one conversation and saying, what are we doing? And the importance of that, I think, is exemplified by where we've been going, in that you can't solve the ship problem without knowing what fuel type you're going to use, and that might be multiple fuels for different ships. So it's not just the connectors that you've got to put in place, you have to have the energy or fuel supply to each port, which is appropriate for the ships and boats that are using it. And then you need to think about where the fuel production and energy production pathway is coming from to get there, as well. And there's the infrastructure, and you have to have the infrastructure before you have the boats. You can't go and buy a newfangled boat and then decide you're going to put the infrastructure in. So it has to be a plan-led rollout. And going back to your point on innovation, is we have a strategic choice, if you like, as whether we're in front of the curve, behind the curve, or in the middle of the curve. And each of those scenarios give us different pros and cons, and maybe that's a theme for that kind of round table meeting. But it does feel that we need to kind of present the full spectrum of technical thoughts locally and have a discussion that allows us to thrash that a bit. I don't know what others think about that.
Anybody disagree with that as a starting point? Willie, you make a point? Personally, I think you're right with that.
I would say you're talking a lot of sense there, Gareth, but the problem is, historically, it is just a bloody mess, and that's the only way I can describe it. Every situation that we've come, as Neil has spoken about, the situation where they're more or less deciding to build monohull boats to replace the existing North Isles boats is, I'm convinced, controlled by the existing terminals. There's never any future proofing when they build anything. I mean, the classic example is Hatston. Lerwick, fortunately, is the only one that's got a decent link span, because they had the Faroese ship coming at the time that was going, and Lerwick is a private port. But Scrabster, Stromness, Hatston, they put in new link spans in 2002. It was a golden opportunity to do something with a bit of future proofing in it. Did they what? They just built it for the ships that they were building. And Scotland has got a dreadful history of that. Nearly every one of the upgrades on Karl Marx, of course, it's easy to blame them, and probably most people are not aware that a lot of the ports on the West Coast are trust ports, some of them. Others of them are operated by the local authority. Some are operated by CMAL, but not that many. But it is a terrible mishmash. I mean, you've got a situation there at Arran where they built a new pier. Personally, I don't think it's facing the right way, but that's got nothing to do with it. I'm not going to tell them how to run a boat in the Clyde. But they then had nothing done at the mainland Scotland terminal in Ardrossan, which is their shortest port. They've now had to go and operate from Troon, and they have a ship that's been out of service for about a year and a half being repaired. I think it's possibly going to be back in service at the end of this month, and that'll restore the Troon bit. But the other vessel, the new 7-year late Glensannox, is having to run from Troon because it's too big for the existing facilities at Ardrossan. There's so much of this is just absolutely unbelievable. Likewise, we had the opportunity in 2002 when the new Northlink ships came. The money was just thrown at it by British government and Scottish government, get it in service, because they set themselves a timescale that was almost impossible. They didn't even think about shore power at the pier at Stromness. That's been put in at massive cost 23 years after the ship went into service. And probably another thing a lot of people are not aware of, shore power is nothing new. The St. Ola that was on the Pentland Firth crossing from 1951 was plugged into shore power every night. the North Isles boats, from when they went to diesel driven from steam in 1962 onwards, were always plugged into shore power every night. I mean, the St. Ola that was built in 1974 was also on shore power. She was replaced by a Scandinavian ship that was bought second-hand in 1992, which did not have the capability to be plugged into shore power. But it's just a thing that seems to be, there's a rush in so many of these things, and we don't think ahead, do any future-proofing at all.
So I think it comes back to Gareth's point about probably convening something which allows us to actually air this stuff and change the way we operate. Andy.
Hi, Neil. Can I ask a bit of a fashionable question here, which there's probably no great answer to, but I'd just be interested in your thoughts. We've often sort of talked about the outer isle ferries and having this idea of lugging your car around, this expectation that we can just put our chunk of metal on a boat. And the alternative might be to have fast ferries, more efficient, and a slimmed down or less frequent sort of cargo service. I just wondered on your reflections, and that's a big behavioural change. And it's something that we're not seeing that kind of change in the rest of, society. We're still jumping on a plane and expecting we can go anywhere. I'm not seeing that change. And I just wondered on your reflections on how we navigate almost, if we decided to go down that route of imposing it in a sense, it would be a sudden cliff edge in terms of change for those communities. And that's something we need to deal with because we need to take those communities along with us. But maybe one glimmer of hope is that if we can offer something that's slimmed down, faster passenger ferries, fewer cargo, that might be cheaper. And should that investment, it's a bit of a rhetorical question, you're going to say yes, go into things like electric cars available at Quayside for islanders. But I'd be interested in your reflections on that, because it's easy to say this stuff, it's really difficult to carry people.
There's a load of bits in there. I mean, I think we'll see how the ZEVI side of things works, because if people like the fact that Westry becomes 30 minutes or whatever it's going to be, why would you take the plodding one when I can do this? And I'll sacrifice the convenience of the car because I get there an hour and a bit earlier. Maybe that'll be a driver. The other thing is, when we did Reflex, I think we made a mistake in the co-wheels offering, because we tried to make electric cars and get people into car clubs. If we just put petrol cars and got people into car clubs, at a later date we could have made it electric. So I suspect that probably not putting electric cars out on the aisles is a good starting point. Just put cars on the aisles. And just make sure there's parking spaces there and a means by which they can be, just so they go. So that would then help people break the requirement that you have to take your car on the ferry. So I think slicing that down may well be a way it could work. So trying to attract people to something that's better, it's faster, could be one way of doing it. And then the other bit is, rather than being on fourth standby or something, there's going to be a car at the other end, in which case it becomes easier. And the final thing is the freight handling. People go up to the aisles with a load of stuff. At the moment, you have Tesco's carrier bags in each hand and lump your way onto the ferry. A means by which it's sort of basically containerised in the way they do on Hamnavo, in that you put stuff into a small container and it gets trundled on and it's trundled off at the other end, you take it out of the container, put it in your other car and go. That sort of thing, those minor logistical changes are really, really straightforward to do. So we'll see. This was going to be a little footnote at the end of the AGM, and I'll take it. We've gone down a real interesting hole here. Willie, did you want to come back on something there? Go on then. We'll do that, and then we'll do the AGM, and then Gareth's got a bit he wants to do as well. So.
I'm sorry for hogging the thing, and just a wee bit. Sometimes we have to look at the history of things. One of the biggest problems in the North Isles ferries at the present time is there's lorries going back and forth, sometimes empty, and there is stuff that used to go to the islands in bulk when there was coastal ships. It's maybe a wee bit, I think, out of the box needed. I would say your idea of having cars sitting at the pier has possibly got a lot of merit in it. I mean, if we think about people used to go on holidays a lot of times to the continent where there was people, a couple possibly driving in a car to the south of France, taking 2 days or whatever. Now they fly with EasyJet, Ryanair, blah, 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 whoever it is, for a moderate price, pick up a car at the other end and do it that way.
Yeah.
But I would say in the Orkney North Isles in my lifetime, one of the big changes has been the introduction of RoRo has made it too easy to carry small parcels of bulk. You know, like if the council was doing a tarring job in Sandy 30 years ago, they had a coaster that took 600 tons of tar out at one time, and they put out a few lorries, the road roller, whatever they needed. But now there's situations, I know from ex-colleagues who work on the internal ferries, where there's contractors working in the Isles, sometimes bringing vans back and forth every night.
Yeah.
And it's just stone mad because it's misuse of space that's available on the deck of these ships.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
The salmon industry's got an awful lot to answer for as well. I won't bore you with it all here, but...
Let's not open that one tonight. Let's leave that one. Okay, right. So, that'll do for this one.